Traders, how are you? With Marcello, founder of the Day Trading Academy. Today we're doing the recap of what happened in the markets last week, economy, finances, conspiracy theories. This week we have the government of the UK starting a emergency preparedness website to advise their citizens on how to prepare for emergencies. We also have the FDA warning about a new virus that can kill 1 in 4 people because it's an election year, and that's when the pandemics happen. And we also have Starlink adding on another country dominating the Starlink, the satellite game. Let's go ahead and get started. Markets in the U.S. were on the way up until the Fed minutes came out on Wednesday. They had their worst session in quite a long time. They cast a lot of doubt about the situation with the interest rates because remember, the United States, most of the developed nations, the biggest portion of the economy is consumer spending. And so since the 2008 and 2009 crisis that we had, the financial crisis, some of you youngins may not have been around at that point. However, Marcello was. There was a huge amount of printing of money. The governments around the world dropped the interest rates to record lows in history, not the history of the US, for example, but recorded history. That caused a huge boom. Everybody's out buying stuff. And then all of a sudden now inflation starts to creep up and they raise the interest rates to slow down the inflation. And now everybody can't afford anything anymore because the interest rates are so high that everybody got used to sucking on the tit of the low interest rates. Sorry to be crass, but that's basically what's going on right now. And so everybody's kind of waiting for the federal government, or excuse me, the central bank of the United States to lower interest rates, because once they do that, everybody can go out and afford things again, and it can move 70% of the economy, because 70% of the economy in the United States is consumer spending, which basically relies on debt now, which basically is connected directly with the interest rates. So on Thursday, the Dow fell 600 points, the worst day since March 2023. The S&P 500 hit a record high this week, ended positive. The NASDAQ hit its 9th record high of the year. And in the Communist Republic of Canada, they went up. That exchange went up 0.55%. And some of the conspiracy theory news. The FDA warns 25% kill rate in a new virus. They're preparing for the bird flu pandemic. People could be killed, and they want to be able to prepare with a new vaccine because remember, they can come out with a vaccine of a brand new virus in literally a month or two after it comes out. That's the way. Believe the science. Don't knock it. Believe the science. The UK government. Now, I want to go back a little bit and just remind you of something. I believe it was about 3 or 4 months ago, the permafrost in Russia and in the Arctic and these other places is melting, and they found these new viruses, and they decided to start manipulating these viruses to make them more lethal. Just, I guess for fun, maybe. And if you remember also, during the beginning of the pandemic, there was a situation where there was a conspiracy theory, obviously, about how the virus from the pandemic, I don't want to say it because then they'll ban my channel again, it might have been man-made, completely outrageous conspiracy theory. Well, it turns out it was true. They finally admitted it 4 years later. And why would they be manipulating these viruses to make them more lethal for humans? And on top of that, the UK government has launched a prepare website advising people how to prepare for natural and human-induced emergencies. Things like viral outbreaks, climate emergencies, cyber and terror attacks. I don't know if you remember, but there was this crazy conspiracy theorist in December of 2020 named Marcello who told you about the next 10 years are going to be a very, very bad problem. Because now we have a situation where we're going to have economic problems, social problems, and even a lot of climate problems as well. So prepare yourself, because remember, the preppers were right. Overseas market news, European markets mostly lower. Italy was the biggest loser there. Latin American markets were mostly lower. The Bovespa, which is the biggest market in Latin America, went down by 3.09%. Africa and the Middle East was mixed. Egypt was the biggest winner there. And then in the far, far east, Asia, Australia, that whole area, mixed markets. The positive ones were very, very low percentages. And the Hang Seng in Hong Kong was the biggest loser at over, 5% negative. Bitcoin and crypto news, Ethereum has set its largest two-day gain in nearly 2 years on Tuesday after there's a speculation that a new ETF is coming out for Ethereum. Now, remember, an ETF is an exchange-traded fund. So now people, instead of having to go out and get your wallet and the crypto exchange and all this other stuff, now they can just buy it, for example, on the New York Stock Exchange or wherever they're going to list it. So everybody has a retirement account. Everybody has their account with TD Ameritrade or Schwab or E-Trade. And now they can just literally click a few buttons, and where they have their money, they can just go out and buy it. The SEC approved a rule change, which supposedly is going to open doors for the buy and hold ETF. So now there's a situation where the second largest crypto in the world after Bitcoin is going to have its own ETF to be able to trade on quote unquote normal exchanges. Bitcoin is higher this week, up over 3% to just a touch over 69,000. That hit a record high, if I'm not mistaken. In commodities, the volatility in oil is the lowest in 3 months after a significant range-bound movement that we've had. This has to do with the situation with the expectation of what's going to happen with the global economy, what I just mentioned about the interest rates, for example. If there's an expectation that the interest rates aren't going to decrease sooner rather than later, then that means that the economy is going to get worse rather than better. And the reason why is because people are going to spend less money because they can't afford things anymore, right? In the corporate news, I was going to mention to you guys how now Burger King, after McDonald's, is letting everybody know that consumers are broke, especially low-income consumers, which is their target market. And so now Burger King is bringing back a $5 meal combo to be able to get things moving again in terms of sales because they're apparently not doing well. So if the consumers aren't out there spending money or the economy isn't going to be moving because of the interest rates, that means that the demand for oil isn't going to increase either. So thanks to that, U.S. crude went down by over 3%. Brent went down over 2%. And it's at its lowest point in about 5 months or so. Or excuse me, the volatility is at its lowest in about 5 years, or 2019, because people are kind of worried about what's going to happen with the economy. So they're not putting their money in oil. They don't know what direction to take. In other commodity news, OJ prices, orange juice, have hit a record high after Brazil has its worst harvest in 36 years. If you didn't know, Brazil has 70% of the orange juice exports in the world, but Florida still has the best orange juice, let me tell you. Florida has its own problems also because of the hurricanes and the plagues and the weather. So now New York, the futures in New York, most commodities, things like everything from materials to orange juice normally is on a futures exchange. So that rose by 30% in the last few weeks. Natural gas hit a level not seen since early this year. And even copper, both on the New York markets the futures markets in the US and in London markets, both hit a record high as well. And gold hit a record high after retracing 3.47% for the week. It closed at, or let me tell you the record high, $2,454.20, pulled back to about $2,300 and change. Silver went down almost 4%. It hit a 1-year high of $32.75. It closed at $30.41. Financial and banking news, the central bank in China left its benchmark interest rates at 3.45 and 3.95 respectively, trying to move the property market. One of the things we have to know about how the majority of these markets works is that most developed economies, right now at least, places like the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, Japan, most of people's retirements, most of their investments are in stocks. That's part of the reason why, in order to the word that's coming to my mind is consummate, but that's not the right word. In order to get the economy going, I don't know why that popped in my head, but anyway, in order to get the economy going, what do? They lower the interest rates to get people out and spending money, because in most of the developed countries, consumer spending is the biggest chunk of the economy. That makes the the stocks go up, and then everybody kind of feels good because they see their retirement accounts and their pension and everything going up because that's where the money is. in a place like China, where they're relatively new at being quote unquote developed, however you want to call it, they kind of just came in the game recently in terms of their economy. Most of their money is in the real estate market. So that's why China is looking to move the real estate market rather than the stock market, because their stock market isn't as developed as most of the other markets around the world in all the countries I mentioned. The EU nations formally adopted a plan for using windfall profits of all the Russian assets that were seized in the EU. They're going to sell those and then give them to Ukraine. And it's going to be anywhere between about 50 to 20 billion euros, or between 16 to 21 billion dollars in profits by 2027. The assets are getting exceptional interest due to the windfall profits, and Ukraine is expected to receive the first part in July. Putin also has said that he's ready to go to the negotiating table to have a ceasefire according to the lines of war that we have now, since he's already advanced quite a bit. And the federal U.S. debt has swelled to $34.5 trillion, about $11 trillion from March 2020. So essentially, Biden has added about a third of the debt that we have right now. And if you guys remember, this is kind of what I always tell you guys about politics. Even though one party is less corrupt than the other, they're both at the end of the day corrupt. They're both kind of driving the car off the cliff. It's just one is driving the car slower than the other. That's kind of the way that I describe it. But since the crisis that we had in 2008 and 2009 with Bush, which is kind of the right, all the way to Obama, and then Trump, he added a lot more due to the situation in the COVID pandemic. And then now Biden, with no emergency, added over 30% of what we have in the debt. You can see how this is just completely unsustainable, especially if we can continue in the same direction. There's a situation now, which I believe I mentioned last week, where the United States now has to roll over their debt because their debt is expiring. And so now the old debt had 1%, 2%, 3% interest rates, and the new debt has 6, 7, 8% interest rates. So now a third of the debt, the cost of that debt is increasing by 2 or 3 times. And the cost of the federal budget, the biggest expense now that we have in the United States, is the interest on the debt, number one. And now number 2 is the defense spending. So really big problem. It's definitely not something that's sustainable. And even the Federal Reserve, which is the U.S. central bank, the chairman, Powell, said in remarks on Tuesday, I'm going to read this word for word, we're running big structural deficits, and we're going to have to deal with this sooner or later, and sooner is a lot more attractive than later. This is the reason, for example, we see Bitcoin, gold, and silver all starting to move higher, because there's going to come a moment, and it's already happening, where we just don't have the money anymore. And so they're going to go out and print the money, just create the money out of thin air to rebuy our own debt. And when a country generally does that, that's the beginning of the end. For example, in the Roman Empire, same situation with physical silver and gold coins. Instead of paying with 100% silver, they'd mix in another metal in there, like nickel, make it 90% silver, 10% nickel. Then over time, then 70% silver, 50% silver, until, for example, the other armies, the other countries notice that they're getting not 100% silver. They just said, you know what? We're not accepting payment anymore. And that's when the inflation is going to go through the roof, kind of like Argentina and Venezuela. Inflation in Japan is easing, went to 2.5% in April from 2.7% in March, second month that it's gone down. Not a whole lot of political and economic news this week. In corporate news, I mentioned how Burger King now is advising that consumers are broke, and they're coming out with a lot cheaper alternatives in their menu. Alphabet-owned Google is investing another €1 billion in their expansion of the data centers in Finland to be able to drive the AI growth. This is part of the reason why NVIDIA exploded this week. In recent years, a lot of companies have had their data centers in the Nordic countries due to the cooler climates and tax breaks. It costs an absolute fortune to keep these servers and computers cool, so it's a lot easier and cheaper to put them just in a colder climate. If I'm not mistaken, I think they have something in the Atlantic Ocean, in the oceans, where they just drop it in the floor of the ocean, because there it's literally below freezing by quite a bit. The renewables also have been moving quite a bit in the Nordic countries. They have, for example, the last few years 75% growth rate in wind energy. And a place like Finland, for example, the cost of energy is actually negative due to the fact that there's so much wind sometimes. And Target, one of the other largest retailers in the United States, fell by over 8% after they reported a 3% year-over-year decline in sales. So Target is no longer Target. They are sticking with their full year forecast, but even a company like Target, which is, I believe, the 6th or 7th largest retailer, biggest store company in the United States, even they're reporting lower sales as well. So it's not bueno for the economy in the US. Nvidia this week absolutely exploded over 9% after they issued better than expected guidance. They also issued a 10-for-1 stock split. The stock for the first time went over the $1,000 mark, and they also increased their dividend by 150%. If I'm not mistaken, they did something like $14 billion in profit just in the fourth quarter, and they're absolutely dominating the game. One of the reasons why is because a lot of these companies, for example, like Facebook and Amazon and Google, that have all these data centers, they don't really have a lot of places to invest their money. So what they're doing is they're building out the infrastructure for these AI systems, and that's allowing them to reduce their profit and also invest for the future because there's really nowhere else to be able to invest their money, like buying other companies, for example, since there's a lot of regulatory scrutiny at the moment. In technology, Elon Musk signed an agreement with the Indonesian Health Department to be able to offer health remote access via internet to a new health system via the Starlink system. He's absolutely dominating. Starlink has about 60% of the 7,500 satellites orbiting Earth. Absolutely dominates the game. The next two companies, for example, have a lot less revenue. For example, I forget the two biggest satellite companies merged, and they still have thousands of satellite less than Starlink. Indonesia is the third country in Southeast Asia to sign to be able to use Starlink. Philippines and Malaysia is always already on board as well. In trade news, there may be bad news for the inflation front as the ocean container capacity hit a crunch just before the peak shipping rates start. The freight spot rates, or the cost to be able to ship some of these containers, went up by 30%. Bad weather, longer ocean transits, for example, what's happened in the Red Sea through the Suez Canal with the Yemen terrorists launching weapons and missiles at tankers. So now there's a situation where if this continues, or the price continues, we're most likely going to see an increase in prices because it's going to cost more to ship things, basically. International events, the Iranian president Ebrahim Raisi and his foreign minister crashed in a helicopter on Sunday. They both have been reported dead. The International Criminal Court prosecutor said that he wants, let me repeat that. The prosecutor for the International Criminal Court said that he wants an arrest warrant for Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu and the defense chief and 3 Hamas leaders over alleged war crimes. And an interesting fact this week, after a decade-long search, archaeologists made a breaking discovery on the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. A long hidden villa may have been the resting place of Emperor Augustus, which is the first emperor of Rome, who died in 14 AD. That's the news of this week, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Don't forget to subscribe, and remember, the preppers were right.